think about how place might manifest in our lives. How are we aware of it? How does it manifest in artworks, in written, in music, and any sort of form? So that's how I came to it. And the more I started reading, the deeper I got, and the more academic it got. I started by reading things, and you'll see on the reading list, very romantic, The Poetics of Space by Bachelard, and some nice Thoreau. And as I sort of wound my way through it, I ended up reading things like David Harvey, this radical geographer who talks about right to the city and neoliberalism and place as capital that people vie for investment in their place, which then sometimes can cause a disinvestment. So I really sort of read the gambit, and I made a little reading list for everybody who has any interest in it. It's just a good place to start. Okay, so let me get through my introduction, and then I'm going to open it up to the panel. I hope you don't mind, I wrote some things down again. So, although this dialogue on place could certainly be one of pure academics, looking at the history of art, as well as fields of geography, philosophy, architecture, urban planning, an investigation into the issues of place is one that is also, and probably more engagingly, full of direct personal experience. So I'd like to introduce a few foundation ideas and pose a few broad questions about place, which I have come across in my own research, and then let the dialogue build from there. So Tim Cresswell, and if anybody wants to start reading, this is a really good place to start. It's called Place, A Short Introduction. And he does a great job. He's a geographer himself. And so even though he doesn't just talk about it in terms of geography, but he comes at it from all different, he covers all the major writers. But a very nice book, and really, really approachable, very readable. So in his book, Place, A Short Introduction, he simply points out that place is not a specialized academic terminology, not a piece of academic terminology. It is a word we use every day. But it is also a concept which can be quite slippery and hard to define. Place is a significantly broad issue in the complexities of culture. It is geographical, historical and temporal, social and personal, material and metaphysical. I believe that an awareness of place is an entry into a larger dialogue with the world and an intimate communion with the self. Place is context and juxtaposition. It is situation and locus, position and status. It is potentially full and vacant. Place is witnessed through harmony, parallax, or discord. It is recognized in relation to the self, the other, and the collective. Lucy Lepard, who we probably are all pretty familiar with, in the introduction to her book, Lure of the Local, states, place for me is the locus of desire. Places have influenced my life as much as, perhaps more than, people. I fall for places faster and less conditionally than I do for people. Okay. She goes on to admit, though, that in spite of the inherent politics of place and her proclivity for politics, when writing about place, she cannot help but succumb to an entirely out-of-fashion romanticism and nostalgia, which I think we could all say the same thing. She writes herself into a landscape from her own personal experience. She has a hard time not doing that. As a known landscape is a lived landscape. It is a place of experience. This perspective reminds me of Thoreau and his desire to ideally and contentedly project himself into, quote, any retired country house that I see, for I see it to advantage now without encumbrance. I have not yet imported my humdrum thoughts, my prosaic habits, into it to mar the landscape. So although Thoreau might believe that some places are far better off without him, or any of us, we can almost likely agree that we largely understand ourselves in relation to place. This is the approach of phenomenology, and the topic of the discussion is the phenomenon of place. So the phenomenology, the defining of human existence as one that is in place and continually relational as opposed to distinct and separate from everything else. Writers on place such as Yi-Fu Tuan, Gaston Bachelard, and Michel de Certeau fall mostly into this scope. And they relate to Martin Heidegger's philosophies of descent, or dwelling, right? To be in place is to understand oneself. Tuan, for example, who was an important figure on my reading list, sees place as a pause in movement, which I thought was really interesting. this pause in movement. So if space, we move through space. When we stop, we define that as place. Because it creates what he calls a center of felt value. Okay? Or what others have called, which I found really interesting, a field of care. Right? So you can all think about your fields of care. And so sometimes you take that with you, sometimes you leave it behind. Place as a philosophical concept was all but lost to modernist interest in space by way of investigation and fascination in the atomic structure, the infinite and microcosmic space. As space became increasingly infinite, place and its notion of the contained and the container took a back seat. Right? So as we looked out into space and as we went into the atomic structure, we really started thinking about space much more than we did think about place, because it was very passe. But Tim Cresswell then goes back and notes that while geographical engagement, geographers, humanist geographers and descriptive geographers, while they engaged with phenomenological inquiry, they rescued the notion of place from oblivion. It simultaneously constructed a notion of place which some see as essentialist and exclusionary, right, based on notions of rooted authenticity that are increasingly unsustainable in a postmodern world. Okay? Social theorists and radical geographers, I love that term, radical geographer, like David Harvey, see place as a form of capital, competing for investment that cannot be sustained and often ends in a disinvestment or total dissolution of place. Writers such as Doreen Massey argue for a new global sense of space, where its definition is not rooted in fixity or boundaries, right? We're so used to place having clear definitions or boundaries, or even our traditional inward sense of community, but instead on a progressive, outwardly looking sense of place defined by articulated moments in a network of social relations constructed on a far larger scale than we're usually apt to think about place. Right? Think about travel, airports, highways, interchanges, and all the things that fill in those spaces in between. Can we define those as places? And why go? So that's all I'm going to say as far as introducing place. That gives you a really quick, broad view. But I had posed some questions to the panelists and sent them ahead of time, and I'm going to maybe just ask the questions and have each of you, from your own experience, not in any sort of academic way, but from their own background in music and public planning or public works, or creation of artworks or writing, to sort of address these questions. So the first one goes back, there's a binary argument, sort of this argument on two sides on the existence of place. One group of people might say that place is entirely a social construct. Right? We make it up. We decide. Because of our very nature of being social, we define place. That social process defines place. The other side says place is a force that cannot be reduced to the social, the natural, or the cultural. It is a phenomenon that brings these worlds together. So it is in places that exist already, this larger idea of place, in which these things arise, which we are able to be social. So this is essentially like the chicken and egg argument, right? Which one comes first, the people or the place? And so certainly my interest, and I don't think any of your interests might not be with siding with one of these arguments or the other, but I think in recognizing, for me, how place manifests in our works, our actions, and our perceptions. And so that sort of binary argument being out there, I'd like to ask each one of the panelists, how do you define place? How do you think place is created? And maybe you guys can start asking yourself this too. And what are the issues of place which interest and influence you